American Imperialism in Hawaii by Garrett Cooper, Molly, and Ella. Here's some basic Hawaiian history. In 1778, Cook arrives in Hawaii and brings disease with him. Another important piece was in 1848 when the Great Mahili, the division of land between king and chiefs. Also in 1887, King Kalakaua signs the Bayonet Constitution. In 1881, Lilo Ukalalani becomes queen. And in 1893, the Committee of 13 renames itself to the Committee on Public Safety and declares the throne vacant on January 15th. The U.S. overthrows the Hawaiian monarchy, and Stanford Dole, a missionary descendant, negotiates an annexation treaty with the Harrison administration. In 1894, the Dole government, which was a provisional government, declares itself the Republic of Hawaii. In 1896, McKinley becomes President of the United States, and in 1898, Hawaii is annexed. Here we have a cartoon displaying the white man's burden. It demonstrates this by showing the Queen of Hawaii in a very racist and stereotypical way, demonstrating the feelings of superiority the U.S. had to native groups. It also implies that people who were not white were primitive. She is seen trying to give her crown to a pawnbroker for cash, showing how even royalty in Hawaii does not compare to the influence of the United States. And the U.S. does not care about their opinions or respect them. Here we have a quote by John L. Stevens, who was the minister of the Hawaiian Islands, who supported a group of American businessmen in Hawaii who seized control of the islands with the backing of U.S. troops sent ashore by Stevens from a warship in the Honolulu harbor. The Queen yielded her throne as the provisional government took over the palace and declared martial law. Stevens then declared that Hawaii was a protectorate of the U.S. and raised the American flag over the government buildings. Yet Grover Cleveland soon became president after the coup and reinstated the Queen. After this, Stevens was forced into retirement, but writes this letter to Harry E. Burbank. It shows how Stevens views the Americans to be superior to Hawaiians by neglecting what the natives of Hawaii want and what's best for them, overshadowing their culture to the sphere of American ideals. This demonstrates the white man's burden. They viewed American ideologies on such a pedestal that any other people group should be subjected to them because this is the only way they can thrive is from the United States and not from their own governmental systems. Here we have a quote from Rudyard Kipling. This poem addresses the Philippines and the U.S.'s involvement there. It was written around the same time that the U.S. was colonizing Hawaii, and from the title, due to suggestive wording, it shows how the U.S. used the white man's burden to justify their imperialistic behaviors. Here we have another cartoon. This is showing survival of the fittest. In 1890, a wave of Japanese people came across Hawaii to colonize it. This was the race to colonize Hawaii between Americans and Japanese. The American business owners quickly pursued lawmakers to annex Hawaii. Here we have two more cartoons. For the Wishbone comic, it is talking about two territories of Cuba and Hawaii, seeing which one will be annexed during the time of the Spanish-American War. Uncle Sam is seen cutting the turkey, asking which one of them will get the wishbone, or in reality, which one will be lucky enough to become a part of one of the greatest superpowers of all time, which allows them to be granted freedom of many kinds and, most importantly, protection. This proves it was survival of the fittest and white man's burden because whichever one was the fittest will be granted annexation, which in the end was Hawaii. The cartoon on the left proves that social Darwinism was one of the rationales for the imperialism of Hawaii. It shows that the American provisional government the U.S. set up for Hawaii, represented by Queen Liliuokalani, is balancing on the sugar trade. The survival of the fittest will determine whether the provisional government keeps Hawaii under its control or Hawaii remains free. Here we have another quote. When the United States was deciding whether to annex Hawaii, many responses were the same as Daniel W. Mills. He explained how other industrialized nations were already spreading their sphere of influence or gaining land, which got them more money, which got them more power on a global scale. American propaganda fueled nationalism as he brought feelings of superiority by stating Americans made ships swung by the stars and stripes to the breeze floated upon the Union Jack of every port known to commerce. He followed up by asking, shall we tell these people that the United States government is the only civilized nation on earth that has no regard for commercial interests? He's fueling nationalism and the ideal of American superiority to other nations and directly showing how their titles of superiority are at stake. creating the justification of social Darwinism, survival to the fittest, to annex Hawaii.
This is an excerpt from a Honolulu, Hawaii newspaper called the Daily Bulletin, which was published from 1882 to 1895. It was published in English, so it was probably written for the Europeans and not for the native Hawaiians. It shows how the white man's burden was a rationale for imperialism of Hawaii, because in paragraph 1, it talks about how the people are seen as a stiff-necked generation, that's the native Hawaiians, and it is mighty hard to hammer sense and reason into their extremely stubborn and wooden heads. So this is basically talking about how they don't know religion, and the missionaries have the white man's burden to go and help them and teach them the religion so that they can be saved and have salvation. In paragraph 3, it also talks about the white man's burden. It says that the Hawaiians were then idolaters, meaning that the white people were obligated to go and help them so that they could have faith. Later on in the newspaper article, it talks about how the U.S. gained political power in Hawaii through the missionary government. Natives were trained and became the religious leaders of Hawaii as the American missionaries died out. American missionary descendants still remained and eventually became advisors of the king. The missionary government was a way the U.S. created a sphere of influence under the pretense of religion. Eventually, the missionary role in government declined until it was almost gone, but the U.S. still had influence in Hawaii, and this was one of the ways that they were able to create a presence in Hawaii that would eventually lead to the annexation. This is a map showing how the U.S. or the American Empire around 1900 was imperializing. You can see in the Pacific Ocean that at this time the U.S. was also imperializing other islands. The Jarvis Islands and Howland Island were imperialized in 1857. In 1859, the Baker Island was imperialized by the U.S. In 1867, Alaska and Midway Island were imperialized, and in 1898, along with the Hawaiian Islands, Puerto Rico, the Johnston Island, the Palmyra Island, and the Wake Island were acquired by the U.S. Guam and the Philippines were ceded by Spain also in 1898, and then in 1899, the American Samoa became U.S. territory. As seen by this map, the primary type of expansion that the U.S. was imperializing with was overseas expansion. They were mainly trying to get islands and anything that they could get to by water. The type of control exerted over the colony changed throughout the time that the U.S. was involved with Hawaii. First, the Hawaiians had a monarchy, and then a provisional government was set up by the U.S. Eventually, Hawaii became a U.S. protectorate, then a U.S. territory, and eventually, in 1959, a U.S. state. This flight times image is just to kind of show how Hawaii's location is, or was a thing that the U.S. was, it was a reason for imperializing Hawaii. It's close to different things. It's a good stopping way in the Pacific Ocean, and eventually it would also have economic benefits. So the native people of Hawaii had different reactions to the annexation or the proposal of annexation. The Bayonet Constitution in 1887 was actually called the Constitution of 1887, but it was given the name of the Bayonet Constitution because the King of Hawaii was forced to sign this constitution at gunpoint, so that's how it gets its nickname. But sugar trade with U.S. had made the Hawaiians dependent on the U.S. The Bayonet Constitution was created by the Hawaiian League, which was composed of subjects in the Hawaiian kingdom and foreign nationals, behind King Kalakua's back. It stripped the king of his powers and the power of the indigenous Hawaiians. Native resistance forces tried to create a native republic, but then the U.S. created a bill to cancel the island's privileged status in sugar trade, which led Hawaii into depression. The U.S. then agreed to return to sugar trade with Hawaii if they could have Hawaii as a U.S. protectorate, which Hawaii agreed to. Eventually, waves of Japanese came to work on the sugar plantations, and these Japanese people were called the threat of the Asiatics, which meant, basically in American terms, the threat of the sugar trade that was boosting their economy and the threat of the naval base that they wanted to have in Hawaii. Eventually, Hawaii was annexed in 1898 to the U.S. There were Hawaiian protests also after annexation. Annexation was seen by indigenous Hawaiians as an act of war. And it's interesting because during the American Revolution, America was subject to having to be a colony to Great Britain, and now that Hawaii is in their shoes at that time, they aren't really considering Hawaii when they annex them. So this is a picture of deforestation. Sorry, my speaker notes are gone. The sugar industry was completely destroying the land of Hawaii, as in order to produce sugar, land had to be cultivated, meaning trees and forests had to be cut down. This brought upon discontent with the natives of Hawaii, as land and nature are very important and sacred to their culture. Queen Liliuokalani even referred to her people as children of the soil, the native inhabitants of Hawaiian Islands and their descendants. This shows how they see their family, people, and ancestors through the nature of Hawaii, and by Americans destroying their sacred lands, it was a direct attack at native culture, demonstrating that Americans had no respect for native practices and beliefs as long as they could make money. And this quote here on the left is basically just talking about the deforestation that was going on in Hawaii in order to keep the sugar mills running. On this next slide, this is a petition made which objected the annexation of Hawaii. It was made by the Hawaii Women's Patriotic League of the Hawaiian Islands, which was sent to the U.S. government for the purpose of obtaining restoration of the monarchical government. This was after Queen Liliuokalani had lost her throne, and they were trying to get that back and sending petitions to McKinley in order to hopefully not be annexed and to have their monarchy back. This next slide is, this is a photo taken of one of the many petitions of the Women's Hawaii Patriotic League of the Hawaiian Islands. As stated, these were addressed to McKinley in opposition to the annexation of Hawaii. There are lots and lots of petitions sent by both the Women's League, and there was also a league that was for the men of Hawaii, and they sent many petitions to the U.S. in order to try and stay their own free country, but eventually those did not work. This is another petition also sent to William McKinley, once again from the Hawaiian Women's Patriotic League of the Hawaiian Islands. They clearly convey the message of how Hawaiians will stick to their beliefs, as in the petition it states, "No cause whatsoever can arise that will alter or change the mind of the Hawaiian people and their desire to see the monarchy restored." This claim Campbell presents is supported by the amount of petitions and letters that were sent to the American government just from this organization alone. This is another primary source from January of 1898 and a news source called the Advocate of Peace. It displays the discontent indigenous Hawaiians felt due to the news that they may be getting annexed to the U.S. for the commodification of their resources and culture to economically benefit U.S. business owners. The natives showed their discontent by protesting in large amounts to let their opinions be heard, with many sending petitions, with some examples displayed on the previous slides. This altered a lot of people's opinions on whether or not they should annex Hawaii. This source also shows Hawaiians resisting the economic slavery that they were under due to the harsh systems implanted in sugar plantations. They formed gangs in a way of protesting the economic expansion of the sugar trade. And you can see this in the source. It says, on some plantations, Hawaiians would form work gangs under the supervision of a gang leader and hire themselves out by the day or the week. This was a primary means by which Hawaiians resisted the harsh, authoritarian work system on Hawaii's plantations. Before the Civil War, the Louisiana sugar industry was the main producer of sugar in the United States. Yet after the Civil War, the industry was almost completely destroyed. During this time in the United States, there was high demand for sugar, but with nothing to fill in gap, meaning business owners needed to find an ideal location which would be able to fit the very particular conditions sugarcane needs in order to grow. Hawaii was seen as the perfect place between its tropical environment to its location on the Pacific Ocean. It was a gold mine for American investors. The second source on the left shows how Hawaii outproduced the once haven of sugar production in Louisiana. The big success in the sugar boom was due to the annexation of Hawaii and the benefits that came with being a part of the United States, as tariffs were no longer a concern, making it so that sugar from Hawaii could become a major import of America. And this first source on the left just talks about the disastrous effect the Civil War had on Louisiana's sugar industry. And on the bottom, it's talking about as Hawaii was producing sugar, Louisiana was detrimenting from the Civil War. But when Hawaii was able to come into the U.S. tariff boundary, first by treaty and then as a part of the United States, there was a rapidly increased sugar production in the U.S. During the later parts of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, 5 big corporations held... Oh, sorry, I didn't change slides. There, right. During the later parts of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, 5 big corporations held almost complete territorial power over Hawaii. They were Castle and Cook, Alexander and Baldwin, C. Brewer and Company, American Factors, and Theo H. Davis and Company. The extent of power they held over Hawaii is what some historians could even consider an oligarchy. Alexander and Baldwin is a major company that is still in business today, benefiting from the annexation and imperialism of Hawaii. In the early stages of the company, they were known as the Haiku Company and had control over a vast majority of the water and natural resources on Maui. During this time, water and wood were the 2 most important resources needed to keep a sugar mill running, in which on the island of Maui the Haiku Company almost dominated. Alexander and Baldwin had major influence over Maui, as the majority of native people had to work for them in order to have access to a large population of the island's natural resources. They were so successful that their company still is in business today and is still operating in Hawaii and the United States.
Sugar. Sugar was extracted through native labor. It was transported as an export. It was refined in the U.S. The California and Hawaiian Sugar Company refined Hawaiian sugar early 20th century. It was manufactured in the U.S. and sold to the U.S. In 1875, the Reciprocity Treaty eventually led to the Bayonet Constitution. And then the poem on the right shows how some of the native laborers were treated in their work. Global economic development, the pineapple. Hawaii was also named for the production of the pineapple, which was commercialized when James Dole founded the Hawaiian Pineapple Company in 1901. As the first source says, it built into the world's largest fruit cannery, with the key to its success being the canning of the pineapple. The pineapple industry was booming due to the imperialism of Hawaii, with 5 million cans of fruit and juice being produced per day by 1957. Furthermore, Dole's Pineapple Company also blew up in the United States, as the second quote said, by capitalizing on Hawaiian bodies and a Hawaiian aesthetic to appeal to white American consumers who were led to believe that Hawaii was far off an exotic place. This made it so that people in America were curious about this new and exotic lifestyle, portrayed by the advertisements from Dole's company displaying a tropical paradise and slogans such as "Truly Hawaiian," which made it so that consumers were more likely to buy the product. Using this method, not only did pineapple sales go up, but it was also one of the major factors contributing to the tourism industry. The second quote also states, Americans would transition from consuming Hawaiian products to consuming a manufactured experience of the islands themselves. Economic imperialism. The McKinley Tariff was an act made by the United States government in 1890 which increased tariffs on imported goods from outside the U.S. This heavily hurt the Hawaiian sugar industry, as in the graph we can see that in the year 1890, Americans imported significantly less goods due to this tariff. Once Hawaii was annexed in 1898, the graph shows a major increase in imported goods in the United States, helping the sugar and pineapple industry in Hawaii boom as the tariff did not apply to goods imported within the United States. Global economic development from 1750 to 1900. Before the colonization of Hawaii, GDP levels were averagely rising by around $5,000 each year. With the annexation of Hawaii in 1898, the GDP levels of the following years increased by much higher amounts, such as $25,352 from 1898 to 1899, and $8,278 from 1899 to 1900. The addition of Hawaii to the U.S. greatly improved its economy. These numbers and differences can be seen in the chart above. Economic imperialism. The quote is describing how tariffs imposed around the 1890s led to the decrease in shipments from one of the primary places Americans imported pineapple from, the Bahamas. This made it so that Americans started looking for other places where they could import pineapple from, and that was Hawaii. This demonstrates that when an industry collapsed or was struggling, Americans immediately looked for another country outside of the U.S. to gain raw materials and, more importantly, money from, with little to no regard of native cultures that would be affected. The graph shows the boom in the pineapple canning industry around the early 1900s due to the annexation of Hawaii. Economic imperialism. The imperializing country acts paternalistic to the imperialized workman. The U.S. is making money from the Hawaiian labor and other races that migrated to Hawaii through this paternalism idea. American business owners used tactics developed from the sugar industry and implanted them in the pineapple industry. As time progresses, the state of living is still not getting better as imperialist ideals are still being implanted into American-run businesses in Hawaii. Pineapple corporations followed a pattern early established by sugar corporations, a policy of paternalism for which many precedents existed in other parts of the world. Employees were housed in dwellings erected among or near the pineapple fields and were provided free of charge with living quarters, medical care, and other necessities. At the same time, managerial employees of the plantations exercised protective and sometimes heavy-handed paternalistic supervision over the workmen. Causes of migration in an interconnected world. Second, the Republic of Hawaii legislature passed a law that made some 1,300 acres of government land near Wahaha available for homesteading. Once a pasture lease expired. Lastly, Byron O. Clark, Territorial Commissioner of the Board of Agriculture and Forestry, helped bring 13 Southern Californian families to Wahahi to homestead the land made available under the new law. These early migrants and James Dole, who arrived in 1899, formed the nucleus of what would eventually become the largest pineapple industry in the world. The importation of these families ended with an even greater outcome than what the people originally thought they would. They not only started the American footprint for infusing their cultures together, but also started a capitalist dream business with opportunity and large amount of both supply and demand in this newfound home for these families. Causes of migration in an interconnected world. James Dole graduated from Harvard in 1899 and made his way to Hawaii with $1,500 and a dream of making a fortune. His original motives for traveling there were for the opportunities to grow and sell coffee. However, when the coffee was found to be not a viable crop, he switched to pineapple. In order to provide money for his dream of making his fortune in Hawaii, James Dole sold his prize sailboat. Causes of migration in an interconnected world. Dole migrated from his native Massachusetts to the Hawaiian Islands in late 1899 to take up cultivation of coffee at a homestead settlement. However, at the time, coffee turned out not to be a viable crop in Hawaii, so he switched to pineapples. Exporting fresh pineapples to the continual United States resulted in a high level of wastage in that era, before modern refrigerated sea and air transportation. So Dole decided to process the fruit before it was exported. James Dole made pineapples a more accessible product by processing them to keep them from going bad while being exported. He was able to expand not only his wealth, but the wealth of the entire territory due to the increasingly large amount of exports he was sending out from Hawaii. Effects of migration. No one knows where the first pineapple or foreign fruit in Hawaii arrived in Hawaii. Francisco de Paula Marin, a Spanish adventurer who became a trusted advisor to King Kamehameha the Great, successfully raised pineapples in the early 1800s. A sailor, Captain John Kidwell, is credited with founding Hawaii's pineapple industry, importing and testing a number of varieties in the 1800s for commercial crop potential. But it wasn't until James Drummond Dole arrived in the islands that the pineapple was transformed from an American symbol of friendship and exotic locals into an American household staple. James Dole was one of the key immigrants that transformed the Hawaiian economy during the time of the annexation. His large-scale success is still seen today. His brand that he created is still a massive player in the fruit industry, especially his famous pineapples. Him immigrating single-handedly opened up many jobs, created an influx of food, and also rebirthed what a pineapple really was, turning it is to the normal household fruit it is today.
This map shows Hawaii's location on the Pacific, and it's a great location for the import and exportation of goods. The ability to reach so many different places in a short amount of time is a key reason for not only the success of Dole's exported pineapples, but many great Hawaiian companies that impacted the Hawaiian and American economies. And then this newspaper talks about the wonderful idea called the Sailor's Home, which is located in Honolulu and offers long-term shelter for sailors who were discharged from their ships after their duties were complete. They hope to draw them to remain on the island and begin their lives there. This was another form of migration that was surprisingly very successful on bringing people to Hawaii. And then the effects of migration can be shown in this primary source document from the newspaper in 1899, which shows the effects of the bubonic plague brought over from the Americas. Diseased rats from trading posts would infect the Hawaiian Islands and cause a catastrophe. The fire shown was originally started to burn dead bodies from the plague, but became out of control and created a disaster that burned down many buildings. And then when Americans began to migrate to Hawaii, many Western ideologies were brought with them, such as economic and political beliefs and other practices that were common in America. Americans did not only bring beliefs, but also deadly diseases that killed many natives. With many more Americans migrating and natives dying off, the Hawaiian culture was beginning to be lost to American industrial capitalism. And shown in the chart, the native Hawaiian population was decreasing around 1900 when a lot of immigrants were coming over and bringing a lot of deadly diseases. Even though the population by 1920 is brought back up to 41,000, the total population is way larger than it was back in 1890 and 1900, showing how even though native populations are still rising, immigrant populations are outnumbering that, so they still are dominating Hawaii and suppressing the culture. And then for 6.8, the causation in the imperial age, we chose the first bullet point, which is the industrial capitalist practices led to increased standards of living for some and increased availability of consumer goods for most. And the advertisement of the pineapple industry commodified Hawaiian culture in the Americas and in places around the world, which sparked the tourism industry using the same stereotypical slogans and visuals as they did in the early 1900s. The quote from Cultural Survival says that Hawaiian culture is manufactured by ad agencies, and everything in Hawaii can be yours. That is the tourist, the non-native, the visitor, the place, the people, the culture. Even our identity as a native people are for sale. And as the ripple effect of American imperialism of Hawaii in 1898, tourism has skyrocketed in the 20th and 21st centuries. On the graph, you can see how in 1975, 2.8 million people visited Hawaii, and in 2016, 8.8 million people visited Hawaii. And as already stated, unfortunately, the increase in tourism controls the culture of the native Hawaiians. Good living conditions were created for tourists, and consumer goods were made more available so that people would be attracted to Hawaii and want to visit. However, business and tourism companies had no regard for native culture, completely commodifying everything, even the word aloha, which Cultural Survival also states is practically meaningless now because of it's just used when you just enter in Hawaii. This quote from Cultural Survival, once again, also shows how tourism led to mega resort complexes that far surpassed the need of Hawaiian residents. Industrial capitalism created a tourist attraction out of Hawaii and overcompensated for the needs of tourists, and in turn leaving less resources for the people living in Hawaii. It's basically saying how while tourism accommodation went up and how nice it was and how extravagant it was, it decreased the funding for housing and schools and for local populations of Native Hawaiians and other residential people. And then this shows immigration for causation. And in 1778, when Cook arrives on the timeline, there are an equal amount of native populations to total populations. And then disease decreased both populations, but then in the 1900s, population increased because different people groups were recruited by plantation owners for labor. This contributed to a more mixed population in Hawaii, often creating a minority of Native Hawaiians. Tourism attracted people to Hawaii due to heavy stereotypical ads and slogans, resulting in Hawaiian culture being buried under and mixed with many other cultures. And then Hawaiian natives were also pushed to poor farmlands and neighborhoods, as well as you can see on a picture to the right of Japanese immigrant housing from 1900 to 1920. It's not well suited at all, and so many immigrants from Asian countries like Japan and China and Korea and Native Hawaiians were pushed into more poor locations, while more westernized places, visitors such as people from Europe and from America, were given better standards of living. And then here's another example of tourism, is how the tourism industry inflated Hawaii's economy by encouraging investment from foreign countries, driving up the cost of living for native residents and Native Hawaiians. Hawaii's low income was almost double that of the U.S. in 2020 as a direct result of imperialism. Imperialism caused an increase in foreign investment, and in turn tourism because of the economic opportunity, driving up inflation and cost of living. As the graph shows, a rise of Native Hawaiians also made the market more competitive as more people are competing over the limited number of houses now. And then here's another example of tourism and how tourists coming to Hawaii have an overwhelming amount of accommodations they can choose from, between beach houses to condos and to the most popular, staying in hotels. Money is being put into fitting the needs of tourists instead of the Hawaiian residents, when the first quote states, nearly 1/5 are classified as near homelessness and are more likely to be considered poor compared to the national rate, which is shown in the third quote. The graph on the right also shows how much money tourists are pouring into Hawaii per day. This explains why an unequal amount of money is being pushed into the tourism industry instead of helping native populations and their terrible living conditions. And it's because international visitors are making American business owners the most money, so they're putting more money into the tourism industry. Another decrease in living is also for natives is by the U.S. military. The U.S. military is able to profit off of Hawaii, taking natural resources and exploiting land, all while bearing native cultures due to the increase in population from people from the mainland United States and other countries. Natural resources are being extracted from Hawaii for military use, doing almost nothing to help benefit Hawaiian residents from only harming them even further, as tourism was already affecting standards of living. And the quote also shows how on the main island Oahu, the scope of the U.S. military is that it controls around 22.4%. So the land that really isn't dominated by tourism is most likely dominated by the U.S. military, which also decreases the standards of living for Native Hawaiians and residents, because a lot of money is also going into the military, and a lot of their resources are being put into the military instead of them using it. And then another example is some of the more recent protests happening, as the mountain of Mauna Kea is considered by some Hawaiians to be the most sacred mountain in Hawaii, as protests arose in 2014 because it was the chosen site for the 30-meter telescope. Protests all around Hawaii took place, with art being made to try to protect the mountain and also spread awareness. And then in December of 2019, Hawaii's governor, David Ige, said that law enforcement would leave the mountains, but said that the state would support the company should it resume its work. And then the second art, made by Vienna Ray, shows Hawaiians and Puerto Ricans standing together against U.S. imperialism, as information about the protests in Mauna Kea spread around the world, as well as the ideologies it brought to light. Many other people groups felt like they were in the same position as Hawaii, being exploited for money with little regard to their culture. And then here are APA sources. And that's it.